It is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Beth Cohen, who is the Director of Education and Training for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion on this campus. In this role, she directs various training and educational initiatives to strengthen inclusion and further social justice on campus for staff, faculty, and students, including the Words of Engagement Intergroup Dialogue Program, very interesting program, which is a series of social justice intergroup dialogues between groups with historical tensions. Dr. Cohen has worked as a social justice educator for over 18 years, focused on leadership development, violence prevention, and cultural competency. Before joining the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, she worked at the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland for 5 years in communications and research. Before coming to the University of Maryland, she was the founding program director for the Sadie Nash Leadership Project in New York City and Newark, New Jersey, where she supported the community-based leadership of young women ages 14 to 25. Dr. Cohen has a Ph.D. in Social Cultural Foundations of Education from the University of Maryland, and her research focuses on how relatively privileged populations enact solidarity across difference, especially in response to identity-based violence and discrimination. She has her Master's of Education from Harvard University and her Bachelor of Arts in English Literature and Creative Writing from Barnard College of Columbia University. She teaches graduate courses on the culture of education, social justice education, the use of post-colonial cultural studies theories in applied identity-based research, and qualitative research methodologies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cohen.
Hi, good afternoon. So this afternoon, I want to take some time and talk to you about the complexity of solidarity. And specifically enacting solidarity across difference if you are relatively privileged. And by relative privilege, what I mean is unearned privilege, so privilege that is connected to an identity category. So for example, white youth who, for example, are enacting solidarity in anti-racism movements, straight youth who are in LGBT rights movements, among many others. So my questions really are, how and why do people come to enact solidarity in daily life? And again, so in terms of solidarity, I'm interested in solidarity that explicitly attempts to change the status quo, to change everything that Rashawn just presented to us, right? So enactments of solidarity that are specifically about that. And I put in daily life because we often talk about solidarity, and actually a lot of the literatures talk about solidarity in moments of urgent need. And so looking at daily life is as you walk down the hallway, right? As you're walking across this campus, in classrooms, what does it look like? How does it feel? How do people experience it? How do they understand it? So I refer to the young people that I look at as tacit subjects, right? That they're generally not part of our conversations, especially in the education literatures, when we're addressing issues of inequality and discrimination in schools. We often look at, especially if we're talking about identity-based violence or bullying, for example, discrimination and prejudice, we talk about the perpetrators of that violence, and we talk about the targets of that violence. We often also sometimes talk about the adults around them, but I think an untapped, unharnessed potential is young people who are witnesses. And so I'm not specifically interested in any witness of experiences of discrimination, but young people who witness it, have relative privilege, and then build towards solidarity. So this work is based on multi-sited ethnography. I looked at the experiences of young people in 2 schools, and I think that they have a lot to teach us about solidarity. The 2 schools, I call them City High and Boys High. You can see up there that they're demographically very different, racially different, socioeconomic status-wise, they're very different. Boys High, obviously, is an all-boys school. City High was co-ed. And these were both college preparatory schools, meaning that they intended to get their students into college, which is most of our high schools out there. And they were both struggling with identity-based violence, which is pretty pervasive now when you look at most schools across the country, right? That there's some level of identity-based violence. There's a spectrum, but there's some level. And so these schools were not unusual in that. The way they were unusual is that the way that they responded to that identity-based violence is that they really intended and tried to build interventions to support the leadership of students around issues of identity, power, and privilege, right? So they created interventions where they really tried to address these issues in the school and support the leadership of students around these issues. So my key informants who were enacting solidarity across difference were across multiple dimensions of difference. So as I said before, I looked at white youth who were in anti-racism movements. I looked at able-bodied youth who were doing disability rights work. I looked at straight youth and LGBT movements, among many others. Young men who, especially at Boys High, I was looking at often at young men who were doing work around changing notions of masculinity and addressing pervasive issues across gender and sexism. So why do we need to talk about solidarity? Why do we need to think about it? Most of us use the term, we have a sense of what it means, and it's because it's actually very complicated. It's messy, it's unclear. Sometimes a behavior will look a certain way and we'll be like, oh great, that's solidarity. And then later on be like, oh, I'm not so sure that was solidarity, right? So it's under-examined, and it's talked a lot about, but it's under-examined in the same way democracy, liberty, or equality are examined. So we're seeking out understanding the nuances of democracy. How do we make this a democracy? How do we strengthen this place as a democracy? We don't do that as much with solidarity. Partially that's because we assume, I think, and others agree, that we think it is a natural extension of things like equality. So if you have equality, solidarity is inevitable, which is perhaps true, I'm not sure, but the problem is that we need to work towards both at the same time. So we need to understand solidarity better. So as I mentioned before, it's used colloquially, right? Anyone on social media know that there are various ways that solidarity is employed and stated and expressed. It is a form of unity connection, and I think that that's why we use it colloquially. But if we have to state that we are in solidarity with someone, that's because it is not assumed, right? So if I have to say to you, I'm in solidarity with my cousin, it's because you think that there's some reason that I'm not, right? Otherwise, you think we're a family unit, you think we're connected, you already assume that we are in solidarity. So when we have to state it, it's because there's a question of it. Solidarity is also a process, and I think that that's difficult to conceptualize because I think we think of it as an arrival. We think of it as a product, a destination, but it's actually a process, and definitely the young people in my study will show us that as we go further on. There are also multiple forms of solidarity. So when you see the title of this series, Solidarity Across Difference, each of you is assuming a certain type of solidarity. Right? You're thinking about solidarity in a certain way. And I want to go through a few of the forms of solidarity. So the first form, which I think is one of the forms of solidarity that we need to think a lot about in the field of education, is human solidarity. And human solidarity is the notion that we as humans are connected, we're unified, because we are all human. So if you were educated in this country in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, all the way up till today, a lot of the multicultural interventions in your school were grounded in this idea. This idea that respect each other, right? That this is another human, right? And the problem with it is that it's focused on basic survival. It quickly falls apart. As soon as I tell you, you should respect each other, you are all human, so respect each other, I believe that until you show me in some way that I shouldn't respect you, right? Or I just go out into daily life, and there's repetitions everywhere we look that say, actually, that's not true, right? That some of us are more deserving, that some of us are undeserving, that some of us are more worthy or unworthy. And it's based on identity often. So the problem with grounding ideas in the idea that we are all humans, we are all the same, is that we have studies where at the age of 3, white youth are saying problematic things about black faces, right? So if at the age of 3 we're already believing that, right, that the repetitions of everyday life are telling us that, this notion that we are all the same isn't going to work. And it's definitely not going to work just because your teacher's saying it, even if you really like your teacher and you believe in your teacher. So I think this quote by a young woman at City High gives us some ways to think about human solidarity that I think are important, right? And what this quote says is, you don't need to fight for me to get a job or get married, just don't beat me up, right? So she often said to me, look, you know I do like lots of rights work, as a straight ally, you'll see me in these different places, but this is what we need to address here at this school right now, right? It's a human solidarity call. We need to get to the place where we're not beating up each other before we can have these conversations. Right? So she's kind of making a claim or a call that even though human solidarity is somewhat problematic, it might be a place we need to begin. So the next form of solidarity I wanted to talk about is social solidarity, and I'm also going to bring up Beverly Tatum, or Zion, one of the young men in the study kind of inadvertently did. So social solidarity, human solidarity is based on a form of homogeneity, right? It claims we are similar, right? And the claim is based on humanity, that we are all the same because we are humans. Social solidarity does something similar, but does it based on identity categories or identity groupings. So it unites groups with similarity, and it says your similarities are more important than your differences. So if I say we are all Terps here, right? I'm trying to claim that our similarity as Terps is more important than our differences. And that's how I'm trying to unite you. This is a young man, Zion, at Boys High, who talked about why it was important for all the black kids to sit together in the cafeteria to support Beverly Tatum's work. That he felt it was really important for them to sit together, and that it actually allowed him to do a lot of the work he did in his school around sexism and homophobia. That in some ways, having that space, having that place where they could be together, allowed him to do other interventions in his school that addressed issues and pervasive issues. So the last form of status quo, and you saw the last few forms of solidarity talked about, I had the word status quo. And the reason I have the word status quo there is that within every system of discrimination, of marginalization, I think of it as like release valves. We allow for certain types of solidarity to exist. And even in the darkest moments of our history, there will be examples of human solidarity or social solidarity, or in this case, civic solidarity. So these types of solidarity don't necessarily upend the status quo, and so they need to be thought of a little differently than the last two forms I'm going to talk about. So civic institutional solidarity, civic solidarity is we are all Americans, right? Similarly falls apart because we are all Americans until you tell me you're not really as American as I want you to be, or you say something that I think is anti-American, and then you're no longer part of my civic solidarity, right? So they quickly fall apart. And at Boys High in particular, though, the invocation of we are all Boys High brothers, which was said pervasively. I mean, it was all over the school. It was talked about often. This is your brother. Treat him like your brother. Understand him as your brother, right? It was very effective in some ways in interrupting the issues between students. But of course, if you then went outside that school setting and it was no longer your Boys High brother, you didn't have the same connection to that person, right? So it was institutionally really successful, but in the outside world, pretty problematic. And I would argue it wasn't even exactly successful within the school. So this form of solidarity, these last two forms of solidarity, explicitly seek change. So political solidarity is solidarity where we unite to achieve political change, okay? And so this is a quote from Scout, who they, by the way, chose their own pseudonyms, and they chose their own names. Scout was a young woman at City High who was trying to address the pervasive bullying of students with disabilities in her school. And she had started by starting organizations, which were almost like intergroup dialogues, things like that, and then quickly started realizing that there were structural and systemic inequalities that needed to be addressed. And so this is an example, I think, of political solidarity when she says, so I went to their principal and told mine this isn't right. Either they get after-school activities like ours, or we will need to do something dramatic, right? So she was like, hey, I'm noticing the differences of how students are being treated, so you can talk about the issues in the cafeteria, but you structurally are making choices that tell us that those things that happen in the cafeteria are okay, right? So she was making those connections. And the last form of solidarity I want to talk about is cultural solidarity. And I'm using the term in the same way that I use political solidarity. It's a form of solidarity that seeks cultural change, okay? And so this is a quote from Tara, who was a young woman also at City High. The school, one of the interventions that the Gay Straight Alliance at their school, and Tara was very active in the Gay Straight Alliance, decided to do to address just the hostile environment was to just everywhere in the school. I mean, you could not turn a corner, you could not go into a bathroom stall without some form of passive intervention, right? No homo has got to go. This is why you should support LGBT rights. It was pervasive in the school. And so one day I asked her, because she was telling me that when she leaves the school grounds, right, the school had gotten to a place where like all the kids were like, yes, we know, it's everywhere, right? It was very culturally familiar in the space, right? Safe space stickers everywhere. And she would talk about leaving campus and walking to the subway and wearing her pin or her button or her t-shirt or whatever the material culture was that day to declare solidarity, and get harassed. Or when she got off the subway and got into her neighborhood, what people would say to her. And so I said, well, why do you keep it on then? Why don't you just take it off? Why do you make that choice? And she said, I wear this to say to them, this is just the way it is. We think like that. Call us a gay school or whatever, but this is normal here, right? It's a very specific answer. She's saying this notion that we just think like that. One of the definitions of culture is a habit of thinking, right? It's the habits of the mind, the way we think about things. And she's saying we are going to think differently here. So these different types of solidarities, there are many of them, right? So these are just a few examples of them, right? But if our goal is to interrupt systems of prejudice and discrimination and build solidarity across difference that can permeate our most public and most intimate spaces, right? So one of the things the young people talked about a lot is, how do I take this from my school into my home? Right? How do I think about this with my father if I'm a young man doing work around sexism? Right? So our most intimate spaces, then we need to think about solidarities differently. We need to complicate the notion and nuance it so that we can understand that there are some solidarities that are more like straw houses, or maybe even houses of cards, and more like brick houses. And what I'm interested in is us creating forms of solidarity and understanding forms of solidarity so that we can strengthen notions of solidarity so they don't fall apart, okay? Oops. So some discoveries we can learn from these young people. All of them went through a process. They, I don't know if it's one of the privileges of being younger, but they had a very strong sense of process in their discoveries. And they could name it, and they could say, when I was 12, I believed this about gay people. When I was 13, I thought this way. When I was 14, I thought this, and then when I was 15, this happened, and I then thought this, right? They had very clear notions that solidarity for them was a process. And it was a dynamic, it's a dynamic non-linear process, and quite messy at points, but nonetheless a process. And the second thing I'm going to talk about are various types of enactments. So what were the processes like? All of them, across both schools, talked about a specific moment of witnessing or experiencing marginalization that was profound. So while they would point to other times along the way that they saw marginalization or thought about marginalization, there was something that was an interruption of their way of thinking, where they said, no, this isn't right, right? I need things to be different. And that would point to that moment and talk about that moment, even though the moment was 5 or 6 years ago, right, as a crucial moment for them. They all then talked about a process of questioning or reimagining identity, power, and privilege differences. And this process of questioning and reimagining was very supported by certain curricular interventions in their schools. So the depth of how they thought about identity, the depth that they thought about privilege or power, how they conceptualized it, was deeply impacted by the various interventions that were happening in their schools. And so it was very powerful to see that. So some of the discoveries that happened during this process was understanding identity not as binary, right? That identity is actually much more ambiguous, that there's a lot of ambiguity, that privilege is conditional and contextual, right? That privilege changes over time. And so some of the young people, for example, that were doing work around poverty rights movements who identified as lower income were like, no, no, no. I was poor before, and now I am lower income, and now I have to address issues of poverty, right? So they saw privilege as a spectrum. They saw it as conditional, and they understood that they could harness certain levels of their privilege in certain ways. The next part I call integration, because they talked a lot about trying to figure out, right, so these new ways of thinking about identity, these new ways of thinking about power and privilege were brand new to them in a lot of cases. But they felt that they were important, right, that they were they wanted them to be part of who they were. And that they had this process of trying to figure out, how does this fit, right? How can I rebuild my understanding of the world? Right? If I have gotten certain things due to unearned privilege, the escalator metaphor, how do I think about that? How do I conceptualize that? And they went through this process of integrating those ideas into their sense of self and sense of the world. They then did something that I call rehearsal. They talked a lot about the first moments where, for example, at Boys High, the first time one of the young men said something to one of the other young men that was, the other young man had said something homophobic in the locker room, and he was like, hey, it's similar to your example, hey, that's not okay, right? And they saw those moments as terrifying, and they saw those moments as rehearsing almost who they were going to become, right? That this was going to become more of their daily life, but that they had to try it out first. So again, this was a process that almost all of them documented. And it wasn't always, again, linear, but it was very powerful how similar their stories were in this way. So I want to end with talking about a few of the enactments of solidarity. So what does solidarity look like, right? So after they've gone through this process, and sometimes during it, they enacted solidarity in different ways. So what did these enactments look like? What were the difficulties with some of the enactments, et cetera? So I'm going to start with helping, which I think is actually dangerous, because I know and I'm very aware of how critical marginalized and minoritized communities are about the concept of helping, for good reason, right? One of the ways that have been status quo ways of interacting across difference is charity, is pity, right? Is versions of helping and versions of service. And so we have to be always mindful of that and really critical of it. Because within our systems and our status quo system of prejudice and marginalization, we let people help each other at some points, right? And we even praise them for it. And so we need to be critical of helping. We need to think about helping. What does it look like? When is it done? How is it done? But I definitely saw enactments of what I would argue were solidarity that were also acts of service. And so I think we need to complicate how we think about it. So helping was generally done in immediate, urgent moments. It was deeply interpersonal. So unlike some of the other enactments I'll talk about, which weren't just about you and I, they were about systemic and structures, addressing systemic issues and structures. Helping was deeply interpersonal. I'm doing this for you. But it was sometimes the way that it was thought about in the minds of the young people, right, which is something we need to think about, but that it was a political act. So this is a quote by Tara, who basically when I had met her, she had been in a soup kitchen every day after school. In fact, her mother said to me, is there any way you can get her to come home at 3 p.m. because she stayed every day after school and walked to the soup kitchen and stayed there till 8 p.m. And she had been doing that every day for 6 months when I met her, and by the time I left, she was still doing it. and I think had missed 1 week when her family went on vacation. And she worked at this soup kitchen, and I would often ask her, she was very critical of the service of her peers, very critical of it. And so I would say to her, tell me how it's different. Tell me why what you're doing is different than what your peers are doing. And one of her answers at one point was, I think when I'm dishing out food, putting it on someone else's plate who is hungry and who's not supported by most people, it says, I know you deserve what I get. It says that we are connected and that this is normal. They always say to me, you keep showing up. And I say, yes, that is because this is what is right, this is what you deserve, and just because everyone doesn't see it doesn't mean it isn't true. So the act of putting food on that plate she saw as a political act. And so it's important for us to consider helping and think about helping. The last thing I want to say about helping is that, so when I went into this study, I was very anti-looking at service projects, to be honest, because I was very aware of, for example, Lila Watson's quote, if you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time, but if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, let us begin. Right? So I was very, very aware of that quote. I actually had that quote on my bathroom wall. I looked at it every day. But one of the things that I started thinking through this process is, I think helping and caretaking, and obviously these were Aboriginal activists saying that, right? And right, for good reason. But one of the things that I was thinking about is that caretaking and helping is undervalued almost in all dimensions of life, right? The feminist literatures are very clear about that. In labor, we deeply undervalue helping. And so I started wondering, are we undervaluing helping and caretaking in rights movements? And if we are, how do we think about it in order to go forward? So the next enactment I want to talk about really quickly is messaging. And this is similar to Tara's comment about that this call us a gay school or whatever, because we have everything, we have all the messaging, we have all of the material culture around our school saying this is who we are. So the young people who employed messaging, it was very heavy social media, right? They would jump on someone. If someone said something on social media, they'd immediately say, well, this is another way to think about it, or sometimes more aggressively than that. They were pervasive. They were prolific. I would argue that they were obsessive about it in a great way. And they believed that solidarity was contagious, that if you just started seeing it everywhere, right, even in these little ways, right, that you would start believing it. You would just think it was true. And there was definitely evidence in both these schools that perhaps that was true in some ways. They also often talked about the messengers, because I'd ask them, so aren't you a little afraid that it's like kind of just out there and then people will just be politically correct and they'll just say what you want them to say? And they were like, oh, that's cool. I'm okay with that. And for example, one young person was like, yeah, I just want you to fake it until you feel it, right? So just like do it, and then eventually maybe you'll feel it or think it. But start there, right? So I think there's information for us there. There's wisdom for us there to think about, maybe in our own processes, right? When someone says, hey, I don't want you to use that term, right? That we go, huh, okay. And then maybe we don't feel it at that moment, but we perhaps go Google why someone would say that. But that messaging can be a path towards something. So the last two enactments I want to talk about are advocacy and activism. So advocacy, these were the young people who really employed advocacy. Scout was one of those young people. I kind of think of them almost as old souls. They were so okay with things being iterative and that slow change which was going to happen in their schools. They were deeply grounded in dialogue and discourse, and especially dialogue with those in power. So they would find formal and informal power. They would find the people with formal or informal power within their institutions and say, hey, let me have a conversation with you, and this is what needs to be different, right? Not unlike Scouts going to the principal's office and saying, after-school activities need to exist as well for students with disabilities, as well as students who identify as able-bodied. So this is a quote from a young man, Kevin, who at his all-boys high school founded the Gay Straight Alliance at his school. When he founded it as a sophomore, teachers were like, are you sure, right? I'm not sure that the school is ready for this, even though actually they had had a Gay Straight Alliance at the school a few years earlier, but it was a very small group, and it had quickly disappeared, right? So he was like, yes, I am going to start this gay-straight alliance. We need it here. And as a straight ally, it is a necessity that we have this here. And so one of the things that he was really grounded in is reaching out to people with formal and informal power. So when he started the Gay-Straight Alliance, and I met him about a year and a half after he had started it, it was him in a room. And by the time that I had gotten there, there was about 20 students, and by the time I ended, it was about 40 students. This was an institution where nobody identified as gay, right? Every young man in that room identified as a straight ally. And most of them had ended up in that room because he went to, and he was very strategic, the head of the lacrosse team. He went to various people on campus that he saw were people with power and said, you need to join me, and let's talk about why, right? And so that was common in advocacy, that they reached out to people with power that they saw had power, informal and formal power, and asked them to come along with them. So one of the things that I think is also really important about the advocates is this notion on dialogue and discourse. And so one of the things, actually, I heard the young men talk about all the time, like, you just need to slap that guy down, right? Like, that was a common, you need to tell him, like, when they were kind of, brainstorming together, how do you deal with homophobia in this space or this space? You gotta just be like, no, man, right? And he'd be like, well, no. I don't think that's how we can proceed, right? And this was a very advocacy way of thinking. I have people who say, oh, that'll never work, you just have to be louder than them. But our job is to make them understand where we are coming from and understand where they're coming from. It's reaching an understanding, not just tell them stuff, those who might disagree with us, right? So he was grounded in this idea, we need to talk. So the last form of enactment I want to talk about is activism. The activism of the young people was there was a sense of immediacy and urgency, not unlike helping, right? The young people who were doing helping also felt a strong sense of immediacy and urgency. The messengers too, to an extent, but these two groups it was more extreme. It was unapologetically anti-status quo. So while, for example, I saw one of the young people was employing advocacy step over students who were doing sit-in to go meet with the principal, right? So students who were employing activism were doing a sit-in, and a young person who was employing advocacy stepped over them to go and meet with the principal, right? Powerful. So they were unapologetically anti-status quo. We're not going to do it the way that you want us to do it, or the way that you want us to employ it. And in both the schools, there were definitely adults around them that supported the activism of these young people, but it definitely made them more anxious than any of these other forms of solidarity. And the young people themselves had more of a sense of risk. And even though I thought actually there was risk at various points for all the young people in the study, there was definitely a level of risk around activism more so than others. So what is a path forward? Why have I told you all of these stories? I think it's really important for us to think about solidarity as iterative. This is very hard for me, and so that's why I put it first. I want people to be there. I want them to have arrived. But what we actually know about solidarity is that the arrival point, right, if you think there's a certain arrival point, and it's not unlike the glass metaphor, right, the glass may have changed. So what was the arrival point for my parents, right? My parents were taught to be colorblind. They were told, if you are colorblind, then you will be ethical, right? Then you will treat people with respect. I would argue I was also taught that in my schooling, and I would argue that my niece is also being taught it in her schooling, okay? So we need to think about solidarity as iterative, and if we do, there are more possibilities and potential places that we can intervene. There are many forms. They're deeply nuanced. I think we may need multiple forms, and one of the young people talked about helping as kind of a gateway drug. Like, he literally is like, I think that was like my gateway drug. Like, I started doing that, and then I was like, oh, maybe I'll also go to protests, right? That we maybe need to think about forms of solidarity as a process, and that people might employ them in different ways at different moments. And that there's potential here that we need to engage. That we have to stop just talking about the perpetrators, the clear perpetrators. We need to also talk about the witnesses, the young people with relative privilege, the power that we aren't harnessing, which is why I'm so grateful for this talk, this series. And also that smart head and heart curriculum works. It was unquestionable. The young people where they had smart curriculum and they had adults around them who were really familiar with that curriculum were smarter about solidarity. They were smarter about identity and power and privilege. And we need to really think about that curriculum and build that curriculum, and that is potentially a path forward. Thank you.